Okay, now for the rest of this age of empire, um, I asked you about the ramification of America flexing its economic and military muscle on the global stage, giving you three opportunities to write about these efforts: Spain, China, and Mexico. Okay. So with Spain, ultimately what you really should be focusing on is the origins of how we get to the Spanish American War that takes place in the late 1890s and early 1900s. Okay. So you don't have to get into great detail about it, but you can essentially say the United States provokes a war with Spain that in the successful conclusion of that war, the United States would then add the territories of Cuba and Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, right? So Hawaii had been secured already by the late 1890s. The next big thing was uh, how we had managed to target these territories that were under Spanish control. We provoke a war with Spain. We end up fighting this war. The details are in the presentations, but ultimately understand that we come in and we are in essence colonizers, even though we don't call ourselves colonizers, don't see ourselves as colonizers. The reality is that's what they are. They are American colonies, with a sizable American presence, particularly in terms of the naval presence that would be established there. All right. So, just in terms of the details of that. So, you can even mention, if you want to mention a name, someone like William Randolph Hearst, the newspaperman, mine owner, who provokes the war because of the sensationalistic, excuse me, reporting about what happened surrounding the USS Maine, which exploded in Havana Harbor, right? You could also write about Teddy Roosevelt, um, and there were some other personalities involved. And I sort of detail them for you in the presentation. In getting to the problems of China, we have the United States trying to find its way in a place where there was already a sizable European presence. The European nations had decided to divide China because it was so large into, quote, spheres of influence. Okay, so you want to mention the spheres of influence. Who had a part, right? The British and the French and the Germans. You want to understand that each nation had a part, a certain designated area where they were present. And then the United States Secretary of State, John Hay, decides he's going to come in and help America get in by writing an extensive, what's referred to as the open door notes, in which he's advocating for opening the door, essentially, to American goods in China. And how do you do that? Strong support for the existing government, but also doing away with this spheres of influence. It should just be a free market, an open market. Let the best man win. Now, in mentioning China, of course, you want to talk about the difficulties of the growing resentment of European presence, the both the business presence that they had, the colonizers there, or China's not a colony, right? It's still its own country, but in many ways, this European presence was welcome by some and unwelcome by others. And there's also a very strong missionary presence. So we get a growing sense of this missionary effort to pacify or civilize the world. Very important part uh, of the scramble for Africa when 8 European nations end up colonizing almost the entire continent. And also, there is a sizable missionary presence in China, right? And the resentment of that builds up to the Boxer Rebellion. So you want to cite in terms of the rebellion who were the Boxers, why were they called the Boxers, what conflict happened, how it resolved, the people who were brought in to help, the American presence in particular being a key role in helping sort of the government to regain control, and how the Americans sort of ingratiate themselves to the Chinese government and become a preferred provider, if you will, of goods. So that is a way that America sort of flexes its muscle in China. In Mexico, it's all about what happens in the 1910s when we have the dictatorship, the presidency of President Diaz, who'd been in power for several decades, had originally decided in the early 1910s he wasn't going to run for president anymore, and then kind of changes his mind, and we end up having a revolution there. And with the Mexican Revolution that happens there, we have an attempt to overthrow the established government and a series of factions fighting, and the United States trying to find their way in to protect their interests in Mexico, particularly as they looked at rival nations like Japan, like Germany, that were also trying to get a quote foot in the door with Mexico. The British, understand, also have sizable business interests in Mexico. The French have kept some business interests in Mexico, even after the disaster of the 1860s and the failed Mexican Empire that under French control. So there you want to take a look at the presentation, mention some of the important incidents that took place, what happens, for instance, with the Tampico affair, how the Americans invaded Veracruz and occupy essentially Veracruz, um, and the port there for a number of months before they withdraw, the changing support of the that we have of the changing governments, the efforts to sort of destabilize the governments and stabilize newer governments that they thought might be more American friendly. And then, of course, most importantly, at the very end, what we have is you want to really talk a little bit about. I think you should at least mention, if you're going to talk about Mexico, Pancho Villa's role. Who was he as a revolutionary? I mean, you can talk about Emiliano Zapata, right? Zapata matters, but more from the perspective of Mexicans than he does Americans, because for Americans, he's really not the dominant authority or influence that they believed Villa could be, right? Pancho Villa. And when they, quote, turn their back on Villa to side with the existing government, um, this is when Villa decides that he's going to uh, raid American properties, quote, north of the border, invades New Mexico, invades Texas. Several different raids that take place in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Um, so there's a whole lot of stories there, but the very important thing after that is how the United States, as a result of what happened there, and not on a great level of satisfaction from the Mexican government, decides to send an expeditionary force into Mexico to chase Pancho Villa. Understand what America has done. They have invaded Mexico to catch a Mexican rebel that they blame for causing damages and deaths and casualties north of the border. The invasion was, if you think about it, an act of war, but the government was caught as sort of a hard place. They're not yet solidified in their position. They also see Villa as a threat as well. And so America is largely allowed to carry on in many ways during this nearly year-long expedition under the authority of General Pershing, the American commanding general, who will be our commanding general when America joins the First World War. That guy. Right. So General Pershing, oh, by the way, Pershing Square, you might have heard of that. There you go. General Pershing is that man, and they spent nearly a year trying to track down Villa and his supporters to bring him to justice in America. They never do that. Pancho Villa will meet his demise ultimately a few years later as a result of Mexican authorities being able to get a hold of him and executing him. But really, there in terms of Mexico, the United States is putting itself in a position where there's it's really a no-win position, no win for them, because there is so much resentment of America's attitudes towards the conflict, which is only to look at things from an American perspective. So really, there you have these three things you could have written about. If you have any other questions, you can message me through the Canvas inbox. and I'll try to get to it when I'm feeling a little bit better. I actually think right now I'm just going to go right back to bed. But I did want to get these recordings for you.